History does not favor a single system. However, in New York State, he will live in
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
I have a dream. To a new generation of Americans.
Hi, I'm Galila, and welcome to the Revolutionary World of American Government Part 1. During the next 2 hours, you're going to be exposed to enough American government concepts to fill, if not sink, the Mayflower. We'll look at the basics of government, the Constitution and where it came from, federalism, civil liberties and rights, and everything else you'll need to build your very own democracy out of a few common household items.
Since you're watching this on DVD, you have the power to choose how you want to enhance your educational experience. Check this out.
You'll always start off from a main menu. Anytime you want to start over, just select Menu on your keypad. That'll bring you back to the main menu. From there, you've got lots of choices. You can view the program straight through, select which lesson you want to view, take a quick review, tune into some helpful info, take The Revolution, our comprehensive final, or learn more about Cerebellum, the creators of this DVD program. You can also hit Previous and Next at any time in the program to jump between major sections without returning to the main menu. What more could you ask for?
Now, with that out of the way, let's kick things off with Part 1, Introduction to Government.
I'm here in Washington, D.C. on the steps of this nation's Capitol building, the welcome mat of American government. That's right, all that legal and democratic magic that you read about in the papers or watch on public affairs channels like C-SPAN, most of it happens right here.
But that doesn't mean it all started here. Before a government can become mighty enough to deserve its own cable channel, it needs some founding principles. And we'd like to help demystify the origin and nature of American government. And what better place to start than at its humble origin?
Section A, the origins of American government.
Way, way, way back, the ancient Greeks had a lot of time on their hands. When they weren't thinking of sneaky ways to fool the Trojans or inventing science, they busied themselves by tossing around some pretty neat ideas about governments. You may have heard of a guy named Aristotle. He was alive around 350 BC. Aristotle came up with a groovy idea called natural law. Aristotle's theory of natural law holds that society should be governed by certain ethical principles.
When we say ethical principles, we're talking about all the things you should or shouldn't do in society. Aristotle figured that it really wasn't right for a government to disrespect its citizens.
So, based on Aristotle's ethical principles, it wasn't right for a government to come in and take over a citizen's land or steal his leaning posts.
Aristotle's concept that governments should respect individual citizens was rather groundbreaking. But it was unfortunate for the citizens that Aristotle's principles didn't top the charts until centuries after their rockin' debut. After the Greeks and Aristotle, things were stagnant in government development for hundreds of years.
But then the 18th century rolled around and things really started hopping. A bunch of Europeans started making waves with some new revolutionary ideas. We call this period in history the Age of Enlightenment. It took place during the 16 and 1700s.
Stop and listen! We will change the natural law!
During this Age of Enlightenment, philosophers and a handful of other smart guys went around encouraging people to seek alternatives to oppressive government. In other words, governments that didn't abide by the natural law Aristotle proposed way back when. In response, heavy thinkers began to argue a new idea called popular consent. Popular consent asserts that people should be able to participate directly in the governing of their own societies.
One of those heavy thinkers we mentioned was John Locke. Locke, along with a fellow named Thomas Hobbes, took the idea of popular consent a step further and developed it into what is known as the social contract theory. The social contract theory compares the relationship between a society and its citizens to parties entering into a contract.
Basically, Locke argued that all individuals are naturally free. Therefore, people give their consent when they become members of a society. And if a society's government breaks this contract by acting improperly, then the people have the right to revolt. In fact, Locke and Hobbes said that not only do citizens have a right to revolt, they also have a duty to revolt. Pretty radical, huh?
So the social contract theory held that people formed governments to preserve life, liberty, property, and to assure justice. If a government decides to interfere with this, say by laying claim to your CD collection without due process, the contract is broken, and the government no longer has the consent of the people.
And if a population rebels and breaks its contract with an ill-behaved government, they have the right to start a new, kinder, gentler government. And that's pretty much what happened here in America.
Section B, Types of Government.
After the Revolutionary War and before this great big building was built, the Founding Fathers all got together to discuss what type of government to establish. They considered 4 types altogether: the monarchy, the oligarchy, the aristocracy, and the democracy. Now, you probably already know which one they picked, but it's also important to know which ones they didn't.
A monarchy is a form of government in which hereditary rulers, that's people who share the same bloodline, better known as kings and queens, wield absolute power over everybody. If a king or a queen has absolute power, it means they can do pretty much whatever they want.
All the land to the west of the hills shall be yours.
Oh, but darling, I plan to use all the land to the west for my cricket matches.
Oh. Off with his head.
Since the founders knew that monarchy didn't really fly in the American colonies, what with the King of England being an old wet blanket, other forms of government were carefully considered.
There was the oligarchy. An oligarchy is made up of a body of individuals possessing high levels of wealth, social or military status, or achievement. These elite guys and gals pretty much rule everything and everyone. And there was a third form of government called aristocracy. Aristocracy is ruled by a privileged few.
Now, as nice as monarchies, oligarchies, and aristocracies sound, part of the whole reason the descendants of the Founding Fathers left Europe in the first place was to avoid government structures that left little or no popular consent to the people. So they decided to set up a 4th type of government known as democracy.
A democracy is a form of government in which people hold the power to rule themselves. There are 2 main types of democracy. There's direct democracy and indirect democracy.
In a direct democracy, the people all get together and have an equal say in the laws they create. So, in a direct democracy, majority rules, kind of like when people get together to have a town meeting and vote on whether to build a playground or a nuclear power plant.
In an indirect democracy, which is also known as representative democracy, people vote for representatives who work on their behalf to create laws. In an indirect democracy, each citizen gets 1 vote. Once chosen, these representatives then vote within a government structure in order to make and pass laws. This is a 2-step version of democracy.
The Founding Fathers of our country decided to go with an indirect democracy. After all, they figured that at some point in time, America would become a really, really big nation. And if that happened, there'd be no way they could possibly get everyone together in order to facilitate direct rule.
Section C, Characteristics of the American Democracy.
A key idea in American democracy is balance. The delicate balance between many opposing ideas is a theme you'll run into throughout your study of American government.
How did the Founding Fathers achieve that balance, and on their first government, no less? Hi, I'm Jim Lauper, attorney at Democratic Law. Well, there are 6 key components to American democracy, and they're all closely tied to the social contract theory and natural law that we discussed earlier.
The 6 main components of American democracy are popular consent, popular sovereignty, majority rule, individualism, equality, and personal liberty. We'll look at each in turn.
Popular consent is the belief that a government exists only with the consent of the governed, that is, the people. It's a big part of the social contract theory we discussed earlier. With popular consent, government leaders do not get the right to govern from God, from their economic standing, or from their family lineage. They get the right to govern from their governed, the people.
Popular sovereignty is the right a majority of a society has to govern itself. A society determines its destiny by majority vote.
So if a majority of the citizens vote that they want to institute a National Firefighter Appreciation Day, then everyone will get the day off to take a fireman to lunch.
The concept of popular sovereignty is a lot like the next component, majority rule. Majority rule maintains that only the policies supported by a majority of voters shall become law.
Next, individualism maintains that citizens have certain rights that a government isn't allowed to take away. They're called inalienable rights, and they include things like life, liberty, and property. For instance, in America, you have the right to practice whatever religion you believe in. The government didn't give you that right. You were born with it, if you were born in the US of A. In America, it's the government's responsibility to protect that right, and they cannot take it away.
Next, equality holds that all members of a democracy wield equal power.
All qualified citizens get one vote, and one vote only, in American elections.
And finally, personal liberty is freedom from undue governmental interference, including the concept of discrimination, which we'll get to later on in this program.
In America, the government shouldn't tell you where you should live or with whom you should live. That's your own business, and that's personal liberty.
So those are the 6 main components of American democracy: popular consent, popular sovereignty, majority rule, individualism, equality, and personal liberty. Know them, love them, say them in your sleep.
In this section, we gave you a good look at where the ideas for our government came from. Springing from the brains of Aristotle was natural law, which the Enlightenment team from Hobbes and Locke took and expanded into the social contract theory.
With those concepts in hand, the Founding Fathers considered 4 different types of governments: monarchy, rule by kings and queens; oligarchy, rule based on status; aristocracy, rule by an elite few; and democracy, in which the power is in the hands of the people. There are 2 types of democracy: direct, where the people make the laws themselves, and indirect, where the people choose representatives to work on their behalf.
And finally, the 6 main characteristics of a democracy are popular consent, popular sovereignty, majority rule, individualism, equality, and personal liberty.
Part 2, all the stuff that happened before the Constitution was written.
Permanent English settlers first came to America in the early 17th century, 1607 to be exact, in Jamestown, Virginia.
Settlers came to America for a lot of different reasons. Some came to flee religious persecution. Some came because there was an abundance of land to be had. And still others came to enjoy the convenience of 24-hour banking. Whatever the reason, America eventually became the most popular hangout in the world. And soon it was clear that a new nation was born.
Section A, Origins of a New Nation. The relationship between the American colonies and the English crown between the 1620s and mid-1700s played a big part in the birth of the American government. Those early years would greatly affect the decisions the Founding Fathers would eventually make regarding the structure of the American government.
After all those folks came over to what was then the New World, the colonies of settlers and the Crown formed a basic agreement. The Crown determined that it was allowed to regulate trade and conduct international affairs, and the colonies were given the right to govern many of their own domestic affairs, including the power to levy their own taxes. The colonies even got to use the family car, but only on the weekends.
The relationship between the Crown and the colonies worked pretty well until the 1760s.
By that time, England had just sunk a whole lot of money into the French and Indian War as they tried to keep their hold over the New World. When the war ended in 1760 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris, England was left monetarily drained. England turned to the colonies to try and recoup some of its losses and raise money by tightening its hold on the colonies. After all, the money had been spent on the protection of the colonies. England first restricted the westward expansion of the colonies and then passed 3 tough laws, which back then were called acts: the Sugar Act of 1764, the Stamp Act of 1765, and the Quartering Act of 1765. Here's a look at each act.
The Sugar Act of 1764 placed taxes on sugar, coffee, and other products that were exported to the colonies. This raised the prices of goods that colonists got from England.
The Stamp Act required all colonists to purchase things called stamps for all documents, including mail, contracts, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards.
And the Quartering Act of 1765 required colonists to house British soldiers in their own homes.
The Stamp Act Congress, held in 1765, was the first official meeting between the colonists. At this first meeting, they discussed the need to take a first step toward colonial unification against England. All the colonies got together and agreed to team up against the English crown should they attack.
The Stamp Act Congress was followed by the Committees of Correspondence, originally organized in Boston and other Massachusetts towns. The Committees of Correspondence eventually spread throughout the colonies, passing colonists information they needed about the British. This intelligence helped turn public opinion against the English.
And then the ball got rolling, and the colonists got together yet again at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia, September 5th, 1774. 56 delegates attended, representing every colony but Georgia. At the time, the colonists didn't want to do anything radical, just discuss a few issues with the king.
The delegates of the Continental Congress put their demands together on a document called The Stupid List of Stupid Reasons That Stupid England is Stupid. After much deliberation and market research, the name of this document was changed to the Declaration of Rights and Resolves. The Declaration of Rights and Resolves called for certain colonial rights.
The people demand the rights of petition and assembly. The people demand the right to trial by peers. The people demand freedom from a standing army. The people demand the right to elect representatives who will levy taxes.
The English monarch, King George, read the declaration and pretty much said,
"Nuts to this."
So the colonists reconvened in May of 1775 at the Second Continental Congress.
At that point, it was pretty much a done deal, as fighting had broken out in the Massachusetts towns of Lexington and Concord, with what Ralph Waldo Emerson called the shot heard round the world.
In spite of this, the colonists made one last-ditch effort at peace, drafting the Olive Branch Petition, though it wasn't actually printed on an olive branch or signed by anyone.
Sign my petition.
Still, the colonists thought it was a pretty nice gesture, but when King George saw it, he pretty much said,
"Nuts to this."
And then he sent 20,000 troops over, just for fun. With all those troops sitting around, the colonists got pretty annoyed. Eventually, the American Revolution broke out because the king was unresponsive to the colonists' demands.
As the war raged on, the colonists got more assertive. They wanted their freedom from the crown and were willing to put up a fight. We'll see how in
Section B, two important documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation.
The Declaration of Independence is one of the most important documents in our history. It currently makes its home at the National Archives in Washington, D.C. The Declaration of Independence did just what its title states, declared the colonists' independence from England. It's not a very creative title, but it still served its purpose.
On July 9, 1776, the colonists presented the Declaration of Independence, which had been drafted mainly by Thomas Jefferson. The preamble to the Declaration contained many of John Locke's ideas and went a little something like this.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
So basically, the Declaration of Independence said sayonara to the English crown and outlined the principles for a new government. The preamble continued,
Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to abolish it.
After the preamble, the Declaration went on to list all the things England had done to anger the colonists, mostly violations of personal rights. These rights would later be guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, which we'll talk about in Part 2 of this program.
Once the Declaration of Independence was in the can, the colonists went to work on that other important document we mentioned, the Articles of Confederation.
The Articles of Confederation was written in 1776 before the Revolutionary War and was ratified in 1781 after the Revolutionary War. Essentially, the Articles created a league of friendship among the states who, aside from banding together in the war against England, had remained mostly independent. The Articles of Confederation created the type of government known as a confederation. This government gets its power from the states. Basically, it's a league of semi-sovereign states.
The Articles of Confederation was the colonists' first attempt at a unified national government. At the time, few colonists thought of themselves as Americans. They were fiercely loyal to their states and had some problems taking a national government seriously.
Pardon me, sir, but this is where the Continental Congress is meeting.
Yeah, that's a good one, Wig Boy.
In a confederation, the states held most of the power, not the national government. And once the Revolutionary War was over, there wasn't much left to unify the states, and the government collapsed. With no power to tax and no way to regulate trade between the states, there wasn't much the government could do to assert its control on a national level. In fact, the national government was so wimpy that at one point it often forgot Congress was driven out of Philadelphia by its own unpaid army.
You may have wondered just why everyone tended to want such an oddly fashioned, yellow-bellied, limp fish government. Well, think about it historically. The states were afraid to give too much control to one central government for fear that America would turn into another England. In the states' eyes, one central government with lots of power resulted in oppression.
So, the states made their own treaties with other nations. There was no national army, and the budding young country was facing organizational chaos.
That's when the then nearly powerless Congress stepped in and passed a resolution calling for a constitutional convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. And believe it or not, it sounded like a good idea to a fair amount of the states.
Section C, the Constitutional Convention.
Delegates representing the states met back in Philadelphia once again in May of 1787, with everyone but Rhode Island choosing to attend. They came up with two different blueprints for a new government, the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan.
The Virginia Plan called for a strong national government that derived its power from the people, not from the states. The New Jersey Plan, on the other hand, called for a loose confederation of states that would share power with a national government. Eventually, the Virginia Plan triumphed.
One of the biggest hang-ups at the Constitutional Convention revolved around representation in Congress. Remember, the origin of Congress stems from indirect democracy. It was time to figure out how to make representation for each state fair. The large states wanted more power because they represented a larger population of citizens. The small states wanted to make sure they didn't get steamrolled just because they were small. To solve this problem, the delegates came up with the Great Compromise.
The Great Compromise basically established Congress as we know it today. The deal was that each state, no matter what size, would be represented in two ways in Congress. In order to do this, a two-part Congress was formed. The Congress would have two parts called houses. You may know them as the Senate and the House of Representatives.
In the Senate, each state, no matter what its size, gets two representatives. This equal representation in the Senate made the small states happy. On the other hand, members of the House of Representatives would be determined by state population. This made the big states happy. The more people in a state, the greater the number of representatives in the House.
Unfortunately, great as it was, the Great Compromise led to a whole other can of worms. The states couldn't agree on how to determine their populations. Even though slaves were not allowed to vote, southern states wanted them to be counted because it would give them more representation in the House of Representatives.
That pretty much wraps up our look at America in its pre-Constitution years. Before we go on, let's take a quick look back.
So, things were cool between the colonies in England until the 1760s. Then, after the French and Indian War, England, looking to recoup monetary losses, enforced various acts upon the colonists. These acts got the colonists pretty annoyed. The annoyance grew to rebellion, and the colonists began rallying together against England. They wrote the Declaration of Rights and Resolves, asking for rights that had been taken from them by the Crown, and eventually the Revolutionary War broke out.
During the war came the Declaration of Independence, largely drafted by Thomas Jefferson and orally presented on July 9, 1776. After the war, the Articles of Confederation were ratified. They called for a Confederate government where states held most of the power. But some thought states were given too much power. So a constitutional convention was held in order to form another kind of government. Delegates of the represented states agreed on the Great Compromise. The Great Compromise called for a two-part Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives.
Part 3, the United States Constitution.
The United States Constitution is neighbor to the Declaration of Independence here in the National Archives. A constitution works like an owner's manual for a government. It's a document or set of documents in which the laws or principles of a government, state, or society are laid out. On our tour of the Constitution, we'll start with the basic principles of the Constitution, look at the articles it contains, and see then how the heck it got ratified or approved by the states. First up,
Section A, the basic principles of the Constitution.
In this section, we'll cover the general ideas that shape the U.S. Constitution.
One of the main questions facing the Founding Fathers was what type of government to set up. They had just had a bad experience with the Confederacy, which concentrated power in the states with a weak central government, and they were still smarting from the unfairness of the unitary system they had dealt with in England. What the Founding Fathers came up with was a system of government called federalism, which is sort of a combination of the two. Federalism calls for a strong national government, but still leaves some power in the hands of individual states.
And so the states were bound together under a strong national government, but still had some specific powers reserved just for them. Including, but not limited to, choosing their own license plate slogans. We'll talk about federalism in a minute. Sunshine State. That's crazy Floridians.
So, the framers of the Constitution created a stronger national government than had been done with the Articles of Confederation. At the same time, they protected the interests of the states. A big concern the framers had was of putting way too much power in the hands of one individual or one branch of the government. To address this concern, they decided to separate the powers. Separation of powers divides government power between three federal branches: the executive, legislative, and judicial. The Constitution guarantees that each branch is interdependent upon the other branches via checks and balances. This system of checks and balances gives each branch of government a little bit of control over the others, which allows them to check up on each other. That way, one branch is not allowed to monopolize power.
But there's one more concept to rope into this here caravan of constitutional principles, and that's the Supremacy Clause.
The Supremacy Clause lets everyone know who's in charge. The Supremacy Clause holds that the laws of the Constitution and the nation as a whole are supreme in regard to the laws enacted by each state.
The Supremacy Clause means that any legitimate use of power by the federal government takes precedence over any conflicting actions on the state level. For example, if the federal government's judicial branch finds a law in a state unjust and ridiculous,
the state of Maine outlaws the consumption of any food other than lobster and saltwater taffy.
the state has to nix that law. That's because the judicial branch is responsible for enforcing and interpreting laws through a court system. So, on the legal highway, federal laws have the right of way.
Section B, the Articles of the Constitution.
The Constitution of the United States contains 7 articles, and by articles we don't mean Air Force builds bomber or tragedy strikes local rodeo. Article is just a fancy word for section. We'll concentrate more heavily on the first 3 articles because they set up the 3 branches of our government.
Article 1 establishes the legislative branch of the American government. In other words, it created Congress.
Congress is what's called a bicameral legislature. A bicameral legislature is divided into 2 parts. In this case, the Senate and the House of Representatives. The legislature is responsible for making and passing laws.
England's Parliament, with its House of Commons and House of Lords, is another example of a bicameral legislature.
Article 1 gives us the nuts and bolts of the Congress, like who's qualified to serve in the Senate and the House, the length of their terms, how senators and representatives are selected, and how we know the number of reps each state is entitled to.
Another key to the first article is the list of enumerated powers. This list contains 17 powers that the framers really wanted Congress to have. Sadly, the members of Congress didn't get the powers they really wanted, like super strength and X-ray vision, and had to settle for enumerated powers, like the powers to tax, coin money, regulate commerce, and provide for the national defense.
The framers also threw in the Necessary and Proper Clause, also called the Elastic Clause. This clause is the mother of elastic powers. The elastic powers set forth by the Elastic Clause grant Congress with the authority to pass all laws necessary and proper for carrying out the 17 enumerated powers. So, elastic powers stretch Congress's enumerated powers.
The next article, Article 2, establishes another branch of government, the executive branch. It's called that because it has the power to execute the laws of the nation. And who has the power to execute the laws around this here land? The biggest Mac Daddy of them all. The head honcho, the top dog, the big cheese, El Presidente, the President of the United States.
Article 2 spells out the president's term of office and describes the necessary qualifications for the presidential office. It describes what the job actually is and spells out the rules for replacing the president should the president screw up or die.
Article 3 sets forth the description and structure of the judicial branch. For without Article 3, we would have no judicial branch. And without the judicial branch, we would have no Supreme Court. And if we didn't have the Supreme Court, law and order would become a thing of the past, and we'd all be forced into little cells and listen to nothing but Bananarama songs.
Article 3 of the U.S. Constitution establishes the judicial branch of our government. We also call this the federal court system, which includes the Supreme Court. Article 3 also defines the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. The Supreme Court was given the authority and jurisdiction to decide all cases that were considered on the federal level. This includes cases between states or between a state and federal government.
The creation of this judicial system worried some. You see, the Supreme Court is the highest court in the land. They have final say on lots of important issues. With this in mind, the Congress also set up inferior courts, federal courts lower than the Supreme Court, and the states set up their own court systems in keeping with the theme of federalism. But even with these small court systems operating, the country still recognized the Supreme Court as an extremely influential part of the judicial system.
After those first three articles, this fourth one is going to seem kind of boring.
Article 4 defines the relationship between the states and federal government and explains how new states are admitted to the Union. Article 5 tells us how to amend the Constitution.
An amendment is a change. Now, the framers didn't want to make it too easy to change the Constitution. I mean, after all, anything too easy to change wouldn't hold much water. That's why they went with a two-stage amendment process.
The two stages of the Constitution's amendment process are proposal and ratification. Proposals are like, hey, why don't we make such and such a change to the Constitution? Ratification is like, hey, that's a great idea, let's go ahead and make that change. Each stage can occur in two different ways. Let's start with the proposal process. Amendments to the Constitution can be proposed two ways. First, there can be a 2/3 vote in both houses of Congress. Or second, 2/3 of the state legislatures can vote to have Congress call for a National Amendment Proposal Convention.
That second proposal method has never been used, but it's nice to have around because it can be pulled out to whip Congress into action should they not take it upon themselves to propose a constitutional change.
The second half of the two-stage amendment process is ratification. There are two ways ratification occurs. Both ways rest squarely on the shoulders of the states.
The first way constitutional amendments are ratified or approved is by a favorable vote in 3/4 of all state legislatures. The second way is for each state to call a special ratifying convention. If 3/4 of all these state conventions vote in favor of the amendment, then the amendment is in.
It's important to remember that in the 200-year history of the United States, the Constitution has only been amended 27 times, which tells you how good a job the Founding Fathers did when they wrote this stuff in the first place.
Of all the amendments, only one has been repealed or overturned.
Things were looking up. Legal beer was back.
The 18th Amendment, which outlawed the consumption and sale of alcoholic beverages, was ratified in 1919. After a few years, the country decided that prohibition just didn't work.
Beer was back after 13 years, a long time between drinks.
But the only way to repeal an amendment to the Constitution is with another amendment to the Constitution. The 21st Amendment, which made alcohol legal again, was ratified in 1933. So now we have two amendments that just cancel each other out.
And now it's time for Article 6.
Article 6 contains that supremacy clause we told you about earlier. Remember, the supremacy clause says the federal government gets the final say in most arguments about laws between it and the states. Article 6 also states that no religious test will be required to hold office.
Article 6 ensures that church and state are kept separate.
Finally, Article 7 contains the directions for how to ratify the Constitution. Ratification is when the document first becomes legal and binding. A vote of 9 of the original 13 colonies is all it took to put ratification into action. So that's the meat of the Constitution for you. Before we go further, let's take a quick look at the articles we just covered.
Article 1 establishes the legislative branch. It created a bicameral legislature called Congress with 2 houses. The article also gives a bunch of rules that apply to this branch of government. Article 2 establishes the executive branch and all the rules that apply to it. Article 3 establishes the judicial branch and the rules applying to it.
Article 4 defines the relationship between the state and the federal governments, and Article 5 tells us how to change the Constitution. Article 6 states the Supremacy Clause and explains how the federal government gets the final say in most arguments about laws. Finally, Article 7 contains the directions for ratifying the Constitution.
Section C, the drive for ratification.
Once the Constitution was penned, ratification was not automatic. The colonies quickly divided into two separate factions, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists favored a strong national government, the growth of industry, and they supported the newly written Constitution.
But the Anti-Federalists preferred stronger state governments, a weaker national government, the continuance of an agrarian economy instead of an industrial economy, and they really weren't big fans of the Constitution.
Not too hard to decode, right? The Federalists wanted a strong federal government, the Anti-Federalists didn't. It was the same argument. In general, the Federalists were made up of merchants from the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic states and people who owned a lot of land. If you needed a word to describe the Federalists, you'd probably call them elitist.
The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, were small farmers, shopkeepers, and working Joes. They believed in the good of the common man and were in favor of a more participatory democracy. In other words, they wanted the government to be more accountable to the